Look at him. Same coat as last winter. Same tear at the elbow. Same rusted safety pin, holding the seam together like it's ashamed of itself. Poor old Ronnie. Somebody should tell him J.C. Penney sells coats. He works there. He probably can't afford the discount. 32 years pumping gas and mopping floors, and that's what he's got to show for it. A pin and a limp. Sad. Honestly, he'll die broke in that little house on Reservoir Road. Nobody in Brattleboro, Vermont, laughed at Ronald Read to his face. They just talked about him once he'd shuffled past. Chopped wood stacked crooked by his door, boots held together with duct tape, a man everyone had quietly filed under, used up. What none of them knew, not his neighbors, not the men at the diner counter, not even most of his own family, was that the janitor mopping their floors was about to die one of the richest men most of them would ever personally know. He wasn't hiding a lottery ticket. He wasn't waiting on an inheritance. For 60 years he had been running a quiet operation, so patient, so disciplined, so completely invisible that when the number finally surfaced, the whole town would have to relearn everything they thought they understood about who counts. If you'd like more stories about the quiet people who turn out to be the strongest people in the room, subscribe to Karma Lullabies and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Ronald James Read was born in 1921 on a small farm in Dummerston, Vermont, a town so tucked into the hills that most maps needed a second look to find it. His family didn't have much. The Depression years hit farm families like his hardest of all, and by the time Ronald was old enough to understand what money was, he already understood what its absence felt like. He was the first person in his family to graduate high school, and he had to hitchhike 4 miles each way to get there, because there was no bus that ran his route and no car that his family could spare. Neighbors who remembered him from those years described a boy who didn't complain, didn't ask for things, and didn't waste what little he had. That wasn't a personality quirk. It was survival, and it would define every decade that followed. When the Second World War came, Read served in the military and was honorably discharged in 1945. He came home to Brattleboro, the same corner of Vermont he'd grown up near, and he did what a lot of returning veterans in small towns did. He found steady work, and he kept it. For the next 25 years, Ronald Read pumped gas and fixed engines at a service station. The kind of job where your hands stay stained with grease no matter how hard you scrub them. The kind of job most people treat as a stepping stone to something else. Read never treated it that way. He showed up. He fixed the cars. He went home. He did this for a quarter of a century, without complaint, without ambition anyone could see, and without a single soul in town suspecting that underneath the grease-stained coveralls was one of the most disciplined financial minds most of them would ever stand next to. He retired from the gas station eventually, took about a year off, and then did something that confused people who didn't understand him yet. He went and got a part-time job as a janitor at the local J.C. Penney department store, not because he needed the money desperately, not because he had nothing else to do. He worked there for 17 years, mopping floors, emptying trash cans, doing the invisible labor that keeps a retail store running while customers walk past without looking twice at the man doing it. He didn't retire from that job until 1997, when he was 76 years old. To understand why nobody in Brattleboro saw this coming, you have to understand how completely Ronald Read committed to looking like exactly what everyone assumed he was. He drove old secondhand cars long after they'd stopped being fashionable or even particularly reliable. He wore the same handful of coats for years, and when one of them tore at the seam, he didn't replace it. He pinned it shut and kept wearing it. Friends who knew him described watching him walk into the diner in Brattleboro wearing a coat closed with a safety pin, calmly ordering the cheapest thing on the menu, and never once explaining himself because nobody had ever asked him to. He split his own firewood well into his older years, not because he couldn't afford to pay someone, but because that was simply how he lived. He read the newspaper cover to cover every single day, and not the parts most retirees flip through for the crossword. He read the business section. He watched financial television programs with the same quiet, patient attention other men in town gave to hockey games. He didn't talk about what he was reading. He didn't bring it up at the counter of the gas station where he used to work, or at the hardware store, or at church. He simply absorbed it, year after year, decade after decade, and told no one what he was doing with it. His stepdaughter and stepson knew him as a quiet, steady presence in their lives, a man who didn't say much, but who was reliably there. They had no reason to suspect that the newspapers stacking up in his small house on Reservoir Road weren't just an old man's habit of staying informed. They were research. Every single day for the better part of 60 years, Ronald Read was running a slow, patient, completely self-taught financial education, and he wasn't doing it to impress anyone, because he had no intention of anyone ever finding out. He had no formal training in finance, no degree, no license, no career on a trading floor. What he had instead was a public library card he used more consistently than most people use their car keys, and an almost stubborn refusal to spend more attention on anything flashy than it deserved. Librarians at Brooks Memorial Library would later remember him as a quiet regular, a man who came in often, sat with financial reference guides and market publications for long, unhurried stretches, and left without ever mentioning why. He wasn't chasing hot tips. He was building, brick by brick, an understanding of which companies had survived depressions, wars, and recessions without ever cutting the dividend they paid their shareholders. That was the entire secret. Not a secret at all, really, just a discipline almost nobody has the patience to actually practice for 6 decades straight. He is not, as it turns out, entirely alone in the history books. Investors and financial writers have since drawn comparisons between Read and a small handful of other quiet, low-income Americans who built enormous fortunes the same unglamorous way, buying and holding solid dividend payers for decades without anyone around them knowing. What made Read's story resonate so widely wasn't that the pattern was unprecedented. It was that almost nobody believes it's actually possible until they're staring at the paperwork of a man who proved it with his own life, one unremarkable Tuesday at a time, for 60 years. If Ronald Read's story is teaching you something about the value of patience, drop a comment telling me the name of someone in your life who reminds you of him. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Karma Lullabies so you don't miss the next one. Here is what Ronald Read was actually doing with every spare dollar that passed through his hands for 6 decades. He was buying stock in solid, boring, dividend-paying companies. Not speculative bets, not trends, not anything that would have made for exciting conversation at a dinner party, which was exactly the point, because Ronald Read never had any interest in impressing anyone at a dinner party. He bought shares in banks, utility companies, railroads, telecommunications firms, and consumer goods businesses, the kind of companies that don't make headlines, the kind of companies that just quietly pay their shareholders a portion of their profits every single quarter, year after year, decade after decade, whether or not anyone is paying attention. And Ronald Read paid attention. He reinvested nearly every dividend he received instead of spending it. He held his positions for years, sometimes decades, riding out market crashes and recessions and every panic that sent other investors running for the exits, because he wasn't investing to get rich quickly. He was investing the way a man plants an orchard. He doesn't expect to eat fruit from himself. When he died, financial examiners going through his estate found stock certificates for no fewer than 95 different companies, physical paper certificates that he had kept filed away in a safe deposit box, evidence of a portfolio built one small, unremarkable purchase at a time across more than half a century. He never used a financial advisor that anyone could identify with certainty. He never bragged about a winning trade. He never once, in the memory of anyone who knew him, mentioned to a single person in Brattleboro what his portfolio was actually worth. The town saw a janitor in a pin coat. What actually existed was a self-made student of compound interest who had quietly out-earned nearly everyone who'd ever looked down on him. And he had done it with a public library card, a subscription to the newspaper, and more patience than most people managed to summon in an entire lifetime. It would be easy to tell this story as though Ronald Read floated above the small cruelties of being seen as poor, but that isn't how dignity actually works. Being mistaken for someone with nothing carries a cost, even when you know the truth, and they don't. Read spent decades being the man people didn't bother introducing themselves to properly, the coworker whose opinion didn't get asked for, the customer at the diner whose order came last because he wasn't tipping big, and everyone assumed he couldn't. He was invited to fewer things, included in fewer conversations, treated, in the small daily currency of a small town, as a man whose life had plateaued somewhere low and would stay there. He never corrected anyone. He never once, according to everyone who has since spoken about him, used his wealth as a rebuttal to being underestimated. That wasn't weakness. It was a decision, made and remade every single day for 60 years, that his worth wasn't something he needed the town to see in order for it to be real. Some people build wealth to prove something to the people who doubted them. Ronald Read built his in near total silence, apparently unconcerned with whether anyone ever knew, which raises an uncomfortable question for the rest of us. If nobody was ever going to find out, would you have done what he did anyway? Read's answer to that question, lived out across 6 decades, was yes. He never married and raised his own biological children, but he was a steady presence as a stepfather, present for the ordinary, unglamorous work of showing up. He attended church. He kept his community small and consistent. He was, by every account, left behind by people who actually knew him, a genuinely kind, unassuming man, not a secretive eccentric hoarding a fortune out of paranoia, but someone who simply saw no reason to change how he lived just because his bank account no longer matched his coat. By 2014, Ronald Read was 92 years old and had been retired from his janitorial job at Penney for 17 years. He still lived modestly in Brattleboro, in the same unassuming corner of Vermont he had called home his entire life. He passed away that June, quietly, the way he had lived, without headlines, without warning, without anyone outside his small circle of family and close friends expecting the news to be anything other than the passing of an elderly man who had worked hard and kept to himself. His stepson, Philip Brown, later told local reporters that the family had no real sense of what was coming. Nobody expected an announcement. Nobody expected reporters. Read had spent his final years exactly as he'd spent all the ones before it, splitting wood, reading the paper, keeping his own counsel. The town mourned him the way small towns mourn a familiar face, gently, briefly, and moved on, assuming there was nothing more to the story of the quiet old man who used to work at the gas station, and then at Penney's. There was a great deal more to the story. It was sitting, at that exact moment, in a safe deposit box at a local bank, in the form of stock certificates that no one in Brattleboro, Vermont, had ever been told existed. The will had already been drawn up years earlier. The instructions were specific, deliberate, and about to detonate quietly through a town that had spent decades filing Ronald Read under a category he had never actually belonged to. When the estate was finally tallied, the figure came to nearly $8 million, not 800,000. Not 800 million, which would have made him a headline in a different way. $8 million, built dollar by dollar, dividend by dividend, decade by decade. by a man who spent 25 years pumping gas and 17 years mopping floors, who wore a coat closed with a safety pin, and who never once let anyone see it coming. His stepson told reporters plainly that the family was, in his words, tremendously surprised. There is no other honest way to describe finding out that the quiet man who split his own firewood into his 90s had quietly amassed one of the largest personal fortunes most of Windham County had ever heard of, let alone stood next to at a diner counter. It wasn't just the family who hadn't known. It was the whole town. The men who'd worked beside him at the gas station for 25 years. The co-workers at Penney's who'd watched him push a mop past the same registers day after day for 17 years. None of them had known. None of them had asked, because none of them had thought there was anything worth asking about. The will itself was where the second layer of the story arrived, because Ronald Read hadn't simply built a fortune in secret. He had also decided in complete privacy exactly what he wanted done with it, and the decision he'd made said as much about the man as the money itself ever could. If a story like this one changes how you look at the people around you, that's exactly why I make these. Subscribe to Karma Lullabies and tell me below which part of Ronald Read's story hit you hardest. Ronald Read left roughly $6 million split between two institutions in the town that had never known who he really was. Brattleboro Memorial Hospital received the largest single share, close to $4.8 million, designated for the hospital's endowment fund to support long-term operations and care for the community. The Brooks Memorial Library, the small public library where Read had spent countless quiet hours over the decades reading, received a gift of roughly $1.2 million, along with a directive that a portion be set aside to support ongoing renovation and improvement of the building. The remainder of the estate went to family, close friends, and his church, distributed carefully and specifically the way every other decision in his financial life had been made. There was no dramatic public announcement staged in his lifetime, no plaque unveiled while he was alive to see it, no acknowledgement sought or accepted. He had simply decided, sometime in his later years, that the money he'd spent 6 decades quietly accumulating would do more good funding a hospital wing and a library renovation in his hometown than it would sitting untouched, and he arranged for that to happen without needing credit for it while he was still breathing. The lawyer who handled the estate had to walk the family through the numbers slowly because the first read of the will didn't fully land. People hear a figure like $8 million and their mind tries to round it down to something more familiar, something that fits the man they thought they knew. It took repeating. It took the paperwork laid flat on a table, stock certificate after stock certificate, 95 separate holdings accumulated over more than half a century, before the shape of it actually settled into the room. Philip Brown would later describe the moment plainly, saying the family simply hadn't had any idea, and there is a particular kind of quiet that follows a sentence like that. Not celebration, not even shock exactly, something closer to a slow, retroactive recalculation of every ordinary Tuesday dinner, every quiet nod hello. Every year they'd worried, in small ways, about whether the old man was doing all right on his own. The hospital and the library were, by every account, stunned. These were not organizations that had cultivated Ronald Read as a donor. He hadn't attended their galas. He hadn't sat on their boards. He was, to the people who ran both institutions, simply the elderly man who used to check out books and, decades earlier, the customer who occasionally passed through town in coveralls smelling faintly of motor oil. Neither organization had any idea they were quietly connected to one of the most significant single gifts either would likely ever receive. News of Ronald Read's estate spread through Brattleboro fast, and then it spread far beyond Brattleboro. Local reporters picked up the story first, and then national outlets followed, drawn to the almost irresistible shape of it. A janitor, a gas station attendant, A man in a coat held together with a safety pin. $8 million. It was the kind of headline that made people stop scrolling, and for good reason, because it forced an uncomfortable question into rooms all over the country, not just in Vermont. How many people are we walking past right now, filing into categories we've already decided are final, without any idea what's actually underneath? People who had known Read for decades found themselves publicly re-examining every small interaction. The mechanics who'd worked beside him at the gas station, the Penney's employees who'd shared a break room with him for 17 years, the librarians who'd checked out his newspapers and business books without a second thought about what he might be doing with the information inside them. None of them had been cruel to him in any dramatic, cinematic way. There was no single villain in Ronald Read's story, no one moment of public humiliation captured on a phone and gone viral. The unkindness, if it can even be called that, was quieter and more common than that. It was simply the small, constant underestimation that comes from deciding, without ever checking, that a person's outside tells you the whole truth about their inside. There is a particular kind of gossip that runs through a small town when a story like this breaks, and it isn't cruel exactly, but it is unmistakably self-conscious. Waitresses who'd poured his coffee for years found themselves telling reporters, half proud and half embarrassed, that he always tipped fair, never complained, and never once let on. Former co-workers from the gas station, men in their 70s and 80s themselves by then, sat with newspapers open on their kitchen tables, trying to square the version of Ronald Read they remembered. Quiet, a little stubborn, always willing to help with an engine that wouldn't turn over, with the version now being printed in bold type above his photograph. Somebody who'd sat across from him at church for decades admitted to a local reporter that they'd genuinely worried about him some winters, wondered quietly whether he had enough put away to get by. He had, at that exact moment, more put away than almost anyone else in the pews. Financial writers and investment educators picked the story up too, and for years afterward, Ronald Read's portfolio became something close to a case study, cited in books and articles about the power of patient, disciplined, unglamorous investing. 985 different holdings. Decades of reinvested dividends. A public library card, used more consistently than most people use a gym membership. The lesson wasn't complicated, but it was one very few people actually have the discipline to live out for 60 consecutive years. Analysts pointed out something that made the story sting a little more for anyone working in finance professionally. Read had, without a single day of formal training, without a broker managing his account, without ever once trying to time a market swing or chase a trend, quietly outperformed a huge share of professionally managed portfolios over the same stretch of decades. Not through brilliance, through repetition. Buy something solid, hold it, let the dividends compound, don't panic when the market drops, and don't get greedy when it climbs. It is, on paper, the simplest advice in all of investing, and it is also, by a wide margin, the advice fewest people actually follow for more than a few years at a time. Ronald Read followed it for longer than most of the people reading about him afterward had been alive. What made it land even harder was the ordinariness of the man doing it. This wasn't an eccentric Wall Street dropout playing a long game out of spite. This was a farm kid from Dummerston who never made more than a modest wage in his life, doing the single most unremarkable thing imaginable with the small surplus he had left over each month, for 6 straight decades, without ever telling a soul what he was building toward. At Brattleboro Memorial Hospital, the gift strengthened programs and services for a community that had, without realizing it, been quietly cared for in advance by one of its own longtime residents. At Brooks Memorial Library, the funds supported renovations that would serve patrons for generations. Patrons who would walk through doors Ronald Read had helped fund without ever once knowing his name unless they went looking for it. Neither institution turned the gift into a spectacle. There was no wing named in enormous gold letters demanding attention. The gratitude was real, but it was handled the way Read himself had handled his entire financial life, quietly and with more substance than show. What lingered longest wasn't the number itself. $8 million is a headline, but headlines fade. What lingered was the shape of the man behind it. A man who could have, at any point in those 60 years, revealed what he was building. He could have upgraded the coat. He could have bought the newer car. He could have let people know, just once, that the mop in his hands wasn't the whole story. He never did. Not out of shame, and not because he needed people to be shocked at his funeral. He simply never saw the need to prove anything to anyone who hadn't bothered to actually look. That is, in the end, the hardest part of Ronald Read's story to sit with. It isn't really about the money at all. It's about how easily an entire community can walk past extraordinary discipline, extraordinary patience, and extraordinary generosity, simply because it arrived wearing an old coat and asking for nothing in return. There's a particular kind of person this world quietly overlooks every single day, the ones who show up, do the work, and never once ask to be seen for it. If this story reminded you of someone like that, tell me about them in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed to Karma Lullabies for the next one. Ronald Read never gave an interview explaining why he lived the way he did. He never wrote a memoir. He never sat down with a reporter to walk through his investment philosophy, or explain, in his own words, what it felt like to know something about himself that an entire town had gotten wrong for 60 years. He simply lived, and then he died. And the truth arrived afterward, filed neatly in a will, the same way he had filed everything else in his life. Deliberately, quietly, without asking for permission to be more than what people assumed. Somewhere in Brattleboro, Vermont, there is still a hospital wing operating a little stronger, and a library standing a little sturdier, because a man in a coat closed with a safety pin decided, decades before anyone would ever know to thank him, that patience was worth more than proof. He never needed the town to see what he was building. He only needed to keep building it. Think about that the next time you catch yourself sizing someone up in half a second, the coat, the car, the job title, and deciding you already know the whole of their story. Ronald Read spent 60 years proving that the whole of a story is very rarely visible from the outside, and that the people who need your attention least are often the ones quietly carrying more than anyone around them will ever be told. And in the end, the coat wasn't the whole story. It never was. It was just the only part anyone ever bothered to look at.